This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. All right, so the timeline's recording. I'm pretty sure you can see the clock. Cool. So you can tell we're recording. I always like to give people that courtesy. I obviously will I'll send it to you before it goes up, and if you know the drill. So let's get into it. Hello, this is your host, Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. And in this episode, I've got a guest that you guys, if you've been listening to the show for a while, have definitely heard before. My dear friend, Amateur Magus, who runs a YouTube channel under that name. And today we're going to talk about a topic that I've been wanting to discuss, and it actually relates to the most popular video I ever made. The most popular video I ever made was a 101 on the Goetia, right? And what I've noticed is people often forget that the Goetia is within a broader text, a broader grimoire. And what I find even more interesting is why people seem to only care about the Goetia. And generally, I think a good thing to discuss is, okay, so we know the Goetia, everyone loves it, everyone has thoughts on it if they don't love it. But what else is in there? And is all of it as interesting or as useful as that? And just kind of exploring the whole of that paradigm and system, because often the Goetia I feel is very isolated, and kind of taken out of its context, and people kind of use it in ways that don't relate to what it originally was. And I think all of that's a worthy discussion to have. But before we get into that, Dave, can you introduce yourself for those who do not know you?
Hello, I'm Dave the Amateur Magus. I run the YouTube channel Amateur Magus, where over there I talk about the mechanics behind ceremonial magic and occultism more broadly. And I'm fairly noted for knowing the Goetia, fairly noted for doing Melanie adjacent things at the very least. And I talk all about occult books, including a full rambling of some of the books in the Keys of Solomon. And I've practiced out of most of these, so I have a fair amount of knowledge for these.
Yeah, you're one of the true hermetic and grim trad people online. So I feel like we have to start basic, as I always do. I like starting a basic. What are the keys of Solomon? Because I think as simple of a question as that is, and how I think some people might be rolling their eyes and being like, "Of course I know what it is." I feel like a lot of people kind of don't understand they just kind of have a weird idea about it that I don't know is quite correct. So what is it in your view and perspective?
So, in my view and perspective, there's two books. There's the Lesser Key and the Greater Key, and I believe we'll be talking about both later on. The Lesser Key and the Greater Key are they're mostly brought into popular relevance due to Samuel MacGregor Mathers of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn fame, but they're going to be a compilation of many grimoires. So you start out with the Ars Goetia, which is going to be your demons. These are the fun ones, right? These are the things that everyone knows. The demons of the Ars Goetia is a popular term. Then you have the Theurgia Goetia, the Theurgia Goetia, which is going to be the more neutral, more aerial spirits. I believe these are spirits of the compass directions, and this is the only grimoire that I'm not fully practiced in. Then we have the Ars Paulina, which is said to have been rediscovered by the Saint Paul of the Bible fame. I think that that's not true, based entirely on the way that this grimoire works, but your mileage may vary. It's split into two different sections. The first section is going to be the section where it's talking all about the angels of the nativity, and it's also going to have the angels of your nativity, as well as an entire system of angelic practice associated with it, which is more akin to adding the angels of the hours. And then there's the Ars Almadel. Sorry, I get those two mixed up. There's actually this is actually based on an older text, which we'll talk about that later. And the Ars Almadel is a non-functional grimoire that is added just due for the sake of posterity, and you can tell when some monk down in whatever basement of a church he was writing in was trying to very hastily figure out how this was supposed to work and created an entire host of angels out of thin cloth. And then there's the Ars Notoria, which everyone knows. The Ars Notoria is a bunch of meditative practices based on I believe this is a Jewish Kabbalistic practice of if you meditate upon certain things, you can gain knowledge. And then the Greater Key of Solomon is this is where we get the planetary pentacles from. The planetary pentacles are going to be the things that most people are going to know from the Greater Key of Solomon. That being said, this is actually not compelling. This is actually working less with angels, and it's more working with angels very briefly and then employing nature spirits, as interesting as that is, due to the sheer amount of purity that is required for that book to function.
You know, I like you bringing up that
So, yeah.
point because what's so funny about popular discussion about the Keys of Solomon is people forget that it is kind of like upright, good grimoire boy magic. And I feel like there's just this kind of edginess that has grown around the Keys of Solomon that doesn't even really exist in the text, which I think is a common theme in a lot of the sort of um, occult texts that involve spirits or whatever. I've seen it a lot in my recent research with the Shams al Marv, which is a totally different tradition and system, but it's got the same kind of like people view it as this really dark book, but then everything in it is like, oh yeah, you're calling on God. And I think that that's one of the things that's kind of been lost as these books have gotten a lot more popular, and perhaps maybe that is part of why people only care about the Goetia.
It definitely is the reason why a lot of people care about the Goetia, because they think, oh, the occult must be dark and edgy, and then you actually like read what's going on, and then it's like, oh, we're praying to Jesus? Why is Jesus here? Why is Jesus in my weird demon book? Wait, why is Jesus in all of the parts of my weird demon book? Wait, there's more than just the demons? No, I'm going back to the demons, thank you. And if you read the attire that you're supposed to wear, you end up seeing that it really is just you're supposed to be wearing like a king or a saint's attire, effectively. Like you're wearing very ceremonial robes. You've got like the lion skin belt, I think, is in the Goetia. You've got, I remember the thing that put me off from doing Goetia in the beginning was I was reading the attire that was required, and it was like robes. You can probably fudge the robes a little bit. I recommend people fudge the robes by getting like a bathrobe for their starter occult robes. But this was like, you need a wand, you need a sword, you need a sword engraved with specific things, you need a bunch of magical weapons that need to be consecrated right, you need all this kind of thing, and you need like a dedicated mitre, which is better known as like the fancy Pope hat. And I remember reading the fancy Pope hat, and I was like, where am I going to get this? I can't get a fancy Pope hat. I'm not a clergyman. And then that's when I put it away, and then I opened it up years later when I had the stuff.
These grimoires have a lot of like crazy materials. Like I think there's a sort of thing where people read these because I think a lot of people who actually read these are really new in their practice, right? Because they have so much like hype and cultural legend around them, and people read them, and a lot of people are really overwhelmed by it. Um, because fundamentally they're not like quote unquote beginner text, if there is such thing as a like beginner occult text. And I think it does overwhelm a lot of people.
There really aren't any like beginner grimoires. I know that people in modern times have tried to write grimoire companion books that are like, here's how you work these in modern day, but like there's no real book that is like, the grimoire starter package is read the Bible. That's like what the old grimoirists would say is like, you want to work with the demons, you got to be praying and reading your Bible, you got to be reading your Psalms, you got to be doing your daily Catholic Mass, because they were all Catholic back then for, obvious historical reasons. But they really were just, you need to purity max before you can demon max. That was their line of reasoning.
And I think
And
that's how we've gotten these like new practices like demonolatry and whatnot, where people like take the Solomonic demons and they, they reframe them as gods, which I'm going to say something quick about the Goetia. If you read the names of the demons in the Goetia, yes, some are not like from Christianity, but there really aren't many of them that you can argue are reskinned pagan gods. A lot of them are actually just names of like jinn. You'll see a big overlap between goetic demon names and jinn names. I've noticed with slight spelling variances, obviously, because we're talking about different languages. But largely, the goetic demons are not pagan reskins. They're like two or three you can kind of make that case for. But I think people really do see the purity maxing of the Goetia and they don't like it, or they have some other disagreement with Christianity, right? And so they kind of like are like, well, I still like this, even though I don't like, Catholicism or whatever. And so they try to like repackage it in strange ways. What are your thoughts on that? Because I've seen a lot of that.
So, one of the first things that I did when I was trying to practice good evocation was I called up the Archangel Michael, and I was doing some experiments of confirmation, and the confirmations worked out. And one of the questions I asked was, what actually are the spirits in the Ars Goetia? And they took a moment, and I remember this very clearly. They took a moment and they said, they're mostly, and like all of the spirits in the Goetia are some variation of pagan gods that have been demonized, very few, jinn, contractually obligated fae, and fallen angels in a state of demonic continence. So I take that as like what they actually are. But they are all subject to the same spirits, which is why we count them as demons. They're all subject unto Satan, as it were. They're all subject under a maimon, as it were, if you read them. And some of those entries don't read like demons, right? Some of those entries are like, yes, he is completely and totally loyal to the conjurer. And the way that he makes you sin is that he makes you bored, and he makes you bored of knowing the future too much. And that's how he makes you sin. Right. Knowing how, because if you know everything, apparently that causes you to sin more, because it's like, I don't need to do anything. Everything's already written in the future. Which is like a weird thing that is not very demonic. I think that's much more of a, you could argue that that's more of a fae or a jinn type thing. I'm not the most familiar with jinn, but I feel like that's something that they would do.
Yeah, jinn are interesting. I know the jinn very well. I work with them in a Eastern context, not in a like Goetia context. And what's interesting about them is you see a lot more variance than you see within like a traditional like Christian idea of a demon, because there are some jinns that are called shaitans or satans, because the big evil figure in Islam is Iblis, who is a specific named jinn. Iblis is not a fallen angel at all. Iblis is explicitly a jinn from the beginning. And there are the other jinns that kind of like are of that category, and they're shaitans. The interesting thing about jinns, though, is they can cease to be shaitans if they change enough. They have a lot more kind of autonomy and agency. And you'll see varying levels of purity with them, with some of them actually being like, as crazy as it sounds, like benevolent, good spirits. Muhammad infamously said that he had a personal jinn that was tethered to him, that he converted to Islam and then made prostrate and do salat, the ritual prayer, all the time. So there's a lot going on with those type of spirits. They behave very differently, but I think it's very clear that some of the Goetia spirits are them. And there is a thing in Islamic magic and mysticism, specifically in texts like Shams al-Marif or other jinn texts, where you can bind them with Allah, because they're not as powerful as Allah, objectively. So it tracks that it would make sense that these had integrated, and we know in that kind of time period there was a fair amount of like mostly like merchant traders kind of going around, who would have interacted. So it does make sense to me how these jinn could have entered like the West, and obviously Western people see them as demons. There's a story of one of the saints who, when they were in Syria, I believe, came across a jinn who he thought was a demon, and the jinn went up to him and asked him if Jesus died for his sins too. Right? Jinn walks up to him and says, I'm not human, but did Jesus die for me too? And the saint says yes, and then the jinn gets baptized and becomes a Christian, right? One of the saints has this one of their story. Very clearly a jinn, but the saint, when writing this down, called them a demon, right? Because these terms don't exist in Christianity. So I think there's a lot of that going on in these texts.
There definitely is there is a layer of cultural, there is a cultural barrier to the jinn demon dichotomy, because not all demons are going to be jinn, but not all jinn are going to be demons either. And it's going to be up to you to figure out which one is which. That being said, it really doesn't matter if the book calls them demons and says, like, these are demons. Assume that they are demons for the sake of the practice, just to be safe. Because worst case scenario, you're going to have an issue where if you're not counting them as jinn, or if you're counting them as jinn and then you call up like Asmodeus, because I think Asmodeus is one of the named ones in the Goetia, he is straight up a demon. He's straight up a demon. He is not a jinn. He is a aggressive demon who is usually not fun to work with unless you have previous talks. Like, he's one of the ones where you need to have had previous relationships with him. Like, you need to have had conversations with him before, and he needs to, like, know who you are before he actually chills out a little bit.
With the Goetia, one thing that I think people miss, and I wish I had brought this up when I discussed it for the first time publicly, they're not all your demons within the Goetia are not all, they don't all behave the same, and some of them are just straight up really dangerous in ways that, like, if you're working with them and assuming they're another type of spirit, which I mean some of them are, I think assuming them are demons is a good idea, because even if you're working within the Solomonic framework and the spirit you've approached is pretty clearly not a demon, you're still working it from the Solomonic tradition, so I don't see why you would work it in a way that was different than how demons would be treated, right? Because at that point you're not really doing Solomonic magic, right? At that point you may as well just like act like they're a fae and use like Oberon, or break out the Shams al Marif and call them up as a jinn. If you're using Solomonic methods, you should treat them like a demon the Solomonic grimoires would recognize. I think it's just probably a good rule of thumb.
It's really a good rule of thumb, and I think some of the spirits in the Goetia in more modern translations have sections where the author, I remember hearing about a version of the Lesser Key which had the Goetia in it, and the full Goetia was given, and at one point when he gets to a spirit, he writes, author's note, when writing about this spirit, I had a friend of mine of 38 years die. You do not need this energy in your life, and I did not need it in mine. Trust me, do not interact with this spirit under any circumstances. It is actually so bad that in Stephen Skinner's Magician Tables, he lists all of the powers that are given to the Ars Goetia demons. And some of them are just not listed as what they would be useful for, because they're so bad to work with, they outweigh the cost. Like, they are so bad to work with, it outright says that they will just kill you if you evoke them wrong, which is kind of funny because I don't think anyone actually calls that one up anymore because he is apparently that aggressive.
Oh yeah, there's like, I think there are like 3 or 4 in the Goetia that are basically just in the why the fuck are you calling them up category. Like, just don't. I think you should only like, I get this question whenever I talk about grimoires, like, what is the best starter spirit? And I'm like, why are you not just calling up the one that is relevant to what you're doing, right? Instead of being like, well, this is the easy god, this is the easy demon, this is the easy angel. Like, call up the one that's actually relevant to what you're doing, and you're gonna have a better experience than whichever one is easier. Because a lot of these ones that you shouldn't call up, like, there's no reason why you would, right? It's like a why the fuck are you doing that in the first place? Like, what are you getting from that?
My favorite variation of that question is which is more powerful, the angels of the Shemham Farash, which are really easy to work with angels, and Enochian angels. And my question immediately is like, okay, well, why are you asking me this question? Because if you need me to answer this question, you shouldn't be doing either. Like, no offense. But
Well, you're going to get completely different things out of those two systems. So,
exactly. And you're going to get completely different things out of the demons, too. Because certain demons, I've worked with a good couple of these demons, and some of them are really easy to work with, and some of them are awful. Some of them are actually pretty nasty critters. Like, I wouldn't say that they're all sunshine and rainbows, or, I'm sorry, like Hot Topic goth rainbows and goth Hello Kitties, I guess. I don't know what the I'm out of touch, I feel like. I don't know what the goth equivalent of Sunshine and Rainbows is anymore. But that's what it was when I was growing up. So, yeah, no, it's not all goth Hello Kitties and rainbows and My Chemical Romance or whatever. These are hostile things. They are going to be aggressive, and I did have one ask me for my soul once.
oh my God.
No, that happened, and my immediate response was, "You and I both know that's not how this works." And they were like, "I know. I just wanted to make sure that you weren't stupid."
That's pretty funny.
It is pretty funny.
The selling your soul thing is not true, just for anyone who asked that. I feel like I've said that before, but that's an important one to say. So let's go through the other ones.
Yes.
Now that we think people are getting a grasp on what the Ars Goetia is, everyone's favorite. So let's talk about the Ars Theurgia Goetia, which is a funny name to me because Theurgia and Goetia, I just made a video about it. It will come up before this episode goes up. Or actually uses like dichotomous different types of magic. So I find the name in and of itself rather interesting. But what's in it?
So now this is me pulling from the sacred texts a little bit. If I remember correctly, this is going to be spirits of the air. These are going to be more neutral spirits. These are not going to be outright hostile like the Ars Goetia spirits. That being said, they really can't do as much, and they don't really have as defined of a power set. They're more for manipulating people than getting what you want. And an entire hierarchy is given, and for the life of me, I cannot figure out why I would use them at all. I know some people have had wonderful success with them. Some people crack open the Theurgia Goetia and they feel a spirit calling to them and they work out of that, and for those people, more power to them. But this is going to be basically if the Goetia is all the bad and Theurgia is supposed to be good, this is the neutral. This is like the neutral in between, and this really does help with the narrative that when you start the lesser key and you work to the greater key, you start with the demons and then you work through up to the higher forces and then you go to the greater key. So it's kind of filling in the neutral spirit slot here, all things considered.
Because for those who don't know, in the like Renaissance period, Theurgia explicitly, and this does date before the Renaissance. You see the ancient Greeks using this kind of dichotomy. Specifically, anyone with a Platonist influence, it's very Platonisty terms. But Theurgia means divine magic, and Goetia meant essentially like sorcery or like evil magic, or using demons, necromancy. There's debates on where these lines are, but functionally, those were what those terms meant. And then there was a third category, magia naturalis, which meant like natural magic. That'd be like practical alchemy, herb stuff, all that. And they split magic into these three camps. So that title makes a lot of sense, just understanding that. But I do find it funny at a first glance. It amuses me. So the next one is the Ars Paulina, or the Ars Pauline. I've seen people write that different ways. That one I think it's talked about a bit more. I don't really hear many people talk about the Ars Theurgia Goetia, but this one I've seen brought up a few times. It's not super popular, but it does come up. What's in it?
So it starts out, it is a book with two parts, and I might have switched them in the intro when I'm explaining these. The first part is going to be a full table of practice, fully situated, and it's going to have different planetary pairings than the traditional ones, if you're familiar with Kabbalah or just general planetary arrangements. This is going to have different planetary alignments. Like Mars is opposite the moon, which is already really weird. Saturn is opposite Venus, which is incredibly weird. It does do the opposite of Mercury and Jupiter with the sun in the center, but that being the Mars Moon one and the Saturn Venus one is really weird for a lot of people. But going through, what will happen is the first part is all about how to get the angel of the hour of the operation you're working in. And I have seen so many posts, so many people go through, and it is an incomprehensible mess for modern occultists to get part 1 to work right, because it is an absolute nightmare of how do you even draw this sigil, because the sigils in the book are wrong. They're wrong in the book. It uses a different calendar system, and it uses a different astrological system, and it uses aspects of that astrological system that we don't have in modern astrology. So getting those spirit sigils to work is an undertaking in and of itself. That being said, go ahead.
I've seen people use it, and what's interesting is in the pictures, it's basically just like drawings of the imagery in the book. Like people just kind of like
Mm-hmm.
draw it out, and then you just see it, and it's like, all right, so what are you doing with that, right? Like,
Yeah, it's to get the spirit. It's kind of like, I have looked at this, and the only reason I can see this is like, this is ancient planetary hours timings. Like, this is like what they would have used before the planetary hours were like fully established, is my impression.
well, also when you look at any book that talks about planetary hours, I'm gonna crush some people's spirits right here. Um, Most people nowadays calculate planetary hours using like a computer or a phone, which is going to be a good way to calculate it. That's how I think modern people should calculate it. But the thing is, back in the day, they actually couldn't do that. They had to actually figure it out on their own. And so I would wager you're going to have slightly different planetary calculations these people were doing simply because they're doing it by hand, right? If you look at any sort of prayer that's done multiple times a day in accordance to the sun, you'll notice that people calculate them very differently, even on online calculators. So I'm guessing you're going to have some complexity there, let alone the fact that it was presumably a different calculation altogether. Astrology has not been really standardized ever. Like, what we think of as astrology now, like pop astrology, modern astrology, is really not what the ancients were doing. Like one thing that's been driving me up the wall is the lunar mansions are a way of calculating like basically subphases of the lunar cycle. And in India, they use a different number than they do in like Turkey and Arabia. 27 versus 28 lunar mansions, and if you change that number from 27 to 28, completely changes the entire system, right? It messes up every single calculation, and you're looking at an entirely different thing. And so all these astrology timings, which I'm very into planetary timings, I think they're important. You can drive yourself a little crazy with planetary timing, especially ones that are not common, modern, standardized forms of planetary timing. Like if you're using lunar mansions, you pretty much have to divide that out yourself based on the degree of the moon sign. And it can be a pain. So calculating these type of planetary hours, if you're trying to get it right and not approximate it, like get it right to what the grimoire wants, not to what the actual planetary hour based on modern calculations is, you're probably going to drive yourself like mildly insane, just a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. And I will be calling you up whenever you figure out the lunar mansions for information on that, because it's relevant to my Agrippa interests. But the planetary timings and the angelic timings, it's like you read those and then you realize that the sigils are wrong. And if the sigils are wrong, the entire sigil, like you can't go off the examples except for the first one. And the first one makes sense, but it's an absolute nightmare to work out of. And I more power to the people who attempt it, because I've seen people who they try to get it to work, it doesn't work, and then they call and do the invocationary prayer, like the standard, they add the standard "Dear Lord, please let this operation work" style intro to their operation, and then it works first try, and then they basically come to the conclusion that that entire system is wrong, which that's not how old grimoires worked, but more power to you. The second half of the Ars Paulina is actually kind of funny, though, and I think I've talked to you about this a little bit, but the second half of the Ars Paulina is to get the angel of your nativity, which in some translations is called your holy guardian angel. Yeah, so the holy guardian angel in this book is, there is a listing, and then the author gets lazy, of mostly 30 different angels per sign of your ascendant. So this is, again, we're using Greek astrology here. You find out what the angel of your ascendant is, and the way your supposed to work it is you make a talisman out of various metals consecrated on a specific day in order to be able to compel them and call them up in the first place. And they are all subordinate to the different archangels. And it is supposed to bring you the angel that governs I believe it's like the day that you were born. It's like it governs the moment you were born, basically. Which is in and of itself a very interesting concept, because we've gone from demons in Goetia to neutral spirits in Theurgia to now we're fully working with angels in the Paulina. And the reason why it's called the Ars Paulina, I don't know if we mentioned this, is because it's brought up by the Apostle Paul. So, yeah, that's really the be-all end-all about talking about the Ars Paulina. That really is it, except for the fact that I believe it's the first mention of, quote, firearms in a occult grimoire.
So the next book is the Ars Almadel, and this one I never hear about. I forget this one exists. Like,
There's a good reason. There's a good reason you don't hear about it.
So when I was writing up the notes for this show, I was like, I remembered all of them except this one. I was like, fuck, I literally read the Case Solomon. I've worked out the Case of Solomon, and I don't know what the fuck this one is.
The Ars Almadel is a wonderful book that literally no one works out of in modern day. However, it is important, historically speaking, because there was a man who did work out of it by the name of Dr. John Dee. Dr. John Dee worked out of this a little bit because he had a better version. What do I mean by that? Well, this is actually so the mechanics behind the Ars Almadel is you have a wax table altar with holes in it and candles around it, so it's like sitting on the candles, and it's above some incense, and you have like a crystal ball on top if you're Pokeronian, or if you're, depending on which version you're using, you have a scrying speculum on top of it, and you are calling up these angels. And when you call up these angels, you go through, you call up the angels, and the angels are based and tied to the seasons. Now, the thing about that is that depending on the season, the season is determined by what zodiac sign the sun is in. So if it's in Aries, Taurus, or Gemini, jumping the gun a little bit, you have to wear white robes, and the altar has to be white, I believe. If you're in Cancer, Leo, and Virgo, you have to wear red robes. And it continues on for the other two, but the colors of the other two are kind of weird. And it turns out that this is actually based on an older grimoire text. It's actually based on an Arabic grimoire called the Ars Almadel, which is a very slightly different name, but it is effectively the same pattern that you carve into the Ars Almadel in wax, and there's some various things about that are weird, but it's the same spirits for the first 3 different groups. However, it also has 12 full spirit lineups for what you can use these spirits for, and it's very clear that this is a lost in translation style grimoire, because you really can't use it, because it's like when spring is around, when you're working in spring, you can hear you can go through, and in spring you can cause things to grow, cause all this stuff. For the rest of the year, it's like, yeah, cause destruction, get money. If you need anything destroyed, the rest of the year is good. So according to this grimoire, destruction happens 3/4 of the year, and good things happen 1/4 of the year. I hate this grimoire so much.
That's impractical. You want to remind me of some of those planetary magic grimoires have you wait a really long time before like doing anything. Like you get to do a ritual like twice a year, and then the rest is stuff that's completely irrelevant to anything you're trying to do. Um, yeah, kind of. I think there might be a reason why I don't even really know much about it, and why no one seems to. There are a number of magical texts that actually have like major translation issues, and that causes people confusion and problems like endlessly. Like I know the Zohar wasn't translated to English, which the Zohar is kind of its own thing. I don't love the Zohar honestly, but it wasn't translated to English until like 10 years ago.
Something like that, yeah. And it's even worse when you realize that it's not even that it was just poorly translated. It was poorly translated multiple times because it's very clear that the scribe who had to like translate this was having an absolute difficult time even reading what it was that was being written. So he ended up just coming up with angel names whole cloth based on what he saw, and which is why in the, I believe it's the winter angels have a completely different naming structure. They all have L at the end, and the rest of the grimoire has none of them in there. Like it doesn't have L at the end of anything than in the winter section. And the names correlate with the Ars Almadel for various different topics. And it's not even like they just took the first three. If I remember correctly, they take like the first three, like they take the spring section from like the Aries angels, they take the second one from the Taurus angels, and then they take like the third one from, I think, the Capricorn angels for some reason. It is the weirdest situation with that book. So if you're, yeah, at some point, it's not good.
We need some complete nerd to retranslate it. That's what I think needs to happen. Some crazy little nerd needs to go out and retranslate it. It's the best when you find someone who does that and does it right, but until then, I think it's just going to kind of suck.
We need to find like the sacred manuscripts. We need to find the old manuscripts, and then we can retranslate it. That's what we need to do.
And that's going to be a while.
Yeah.
So now let's move to one that people actually talk about. I would say this is the second most popular thing in the lesser key, Ars Notoria.
Ars Notoria is pretty
good from what I know. I haven't worked much with Ars Notoria, but I've heard generally very positive things from people.
Yeah, the Ars Notoria is kind of interesting. So the Ars Notoria gets its name from the titular notary, which is what these are. This is mostly you're praying to God to get a dream that is to tell you if you should continue, and then if you get told to continue, you are allowed to meditate upon the notary, and like the entire thing is very bizarre. But what it's supposed to do is you meditate and you practice what you're trying to learn for however long, I believe it's a couple months, and it is supposed to speed you up in knowing the skills that you're trying to learn at a much faster rate. The only notable thing about this, other than, it's really just fancy monk meditation, is what the Ars Notoria is. That being said, for my understanding is that for literally years, nobody had like solid pictures of the notary in the Ars Notoria versions until like Stephen Skinner a couple of years ago. Which is really funny to me that we just like, yes, meditate upon this picture, and the picture is just not there.
You can meditate on like the concept that a picture was once there. Like you can like
meditate upon the concept of the picture. Yes, that's what you do.
Yeah, you kind of need the pictures for stuff like that. I think in general, like grimoires need the pictures. I don't like it when occult books are printed and there is no picture, but there should be a picture. Or people like describe sigils. I'm like, no, I want to see it. Please just draw it.
We need more occult picture books. Occult picture books win.
Yes, that is the future. So now there is the other part, because there is like another key. It's not just the lesser key. There is the greater key, which is only one book. I don't know why the lesser key has more books in it. That kind of like bothers me on like a stupid level. Like I know that shouldn't bother me, but it kind of does.
It's because all of the books in the lesser key are like actually separate grimoires. Like that's why there's like the Ars Goetia, the Theurgia, the Paulina, but the greater key is just one.
I feel like if it's going to be called greater, it should be bigger and have more things in it. I don't know.
No, it is. It is bigger.
Yeah, but it should have, I don't know. They should, like, make little chapters or something. I don't know. So that my brain is happier, okay? I'm going back in the time machine and explaining this.
I don't blame you. Yeah, no, I get it. I get it. The Greater Key should be the bigger book, and it kind of is the bigger book, but at the same time, the Greater Key is, the Greater Key exists. I've worked out of it. It was the most miserable 3 weeks of my life.
Wait, why? Tell me the story. I'm curious.
So, reminder, last time I was on your podcast, I talked about doing the Opera Melon. The Greater Key is still worse. The Greater Key is, like, still worse than doing that. Because what you have to do for the Greater Key to function is you need to... Okay, so, for those of you who don't know what the Greater Key is, the Greater Key is where we get the planetary pentacles. The planetary pentacles are... it's like 46. We're missing a couple for each of the planets. But it's a group of discs that you can use for magical operations. Now, the magical operation given in the book is to compel the spirits of your local environment in order to get this to work, right? Now, that is not the problem. The problem is that there is a consecration for every single thing you need in the book. What do I mean by this? There is a consecration for the wax you are to make the candle out of. And by the way, you're supposed to have, like, a little virgin child make it. Book's words, not mine. Like, you were supposed to have, like, pure, unicorn-attracting virgin make you the candle. Which we're already off to a weird start. You then have to consecrate the pen, which you're supposed to get from a bird, like a living bird. You're supposed to pluck one of the feathers out, and then you consecrate that using holy water, which is consecrated. You have to consecrate the salt, which is also consecrated. So you've consecrated the salt, the water, you've made the holy water, then you consecrate the incense using the holy water. Then you consecrate the baths. You consecrate the baths multiple times to the point where there is, like, a fast version of the pure, like a fast version of the consecration of the bath water and a slow version of the consecration of the bath water. And for those of you wondering, if you live in a place with a shower, you can just throw some holy water into the shower. It counts for ceremonial purposes. If you're making them out of metal, you have to consecrate the metal, but if you're making them out of paper, you need to consecrate them in a different way, and it is overall just a mind-numbing... By the end of the experience, you have been fasting for 2 weeks on, like, bread and water. You are just working and praying these consecrations to make sure everything is pure, and, like, every single day before you do the operation, like, every single day for at least, like, I think it's a week, you are doing a confession that is effectively, God, I'm sorry for anything that I have possibly done as a sin. I'm sorry for any murders I have committed. I'm sorry for stealing. I'm sorry for lusting after my neighbor's wife. You go the whole 9 yards, and at the very end, you call up the angels, like, angels of the particular quarters. You pray that, and then you ask for the Lord to protect you, and then you compel the nature spirits into doing what you want.
And you want to know what I hate the most about Western grimoire magic? Bread and water fasting. It's horrible. Like, not even, I mean, like, it is fasting, but it's, I don't know, it's not the best way to religiously fast. There are better religious fasting techniques than that one. I hate that one. I think that's the worst religious fasting method.
I personally, absolutely, under no circumstances, like doing bread and water fasting. I've done vegetarian fasting, I've done bread and water fasting, I've done no food fasting, I've done pure water fasting. Of these, I would genuinely say the bread and water fast that I did for the Greater Key, unironically the worst fast I've ever done. Like, it's absolutely brutal.
Well, the problem with, like, any religious fast where you just, like, eat one thing is you start, like, hating what you're eating, or at least for me. And so then you, like, barely want to eat at all. if that makes any sense. Like, I almost think it's better to do like a hard fast where like religiously there's some fast where you literally eat no water or food from like sunrise to sundown, and that's almost better because you can eat whatever the fuck you want before like at like 4 a.m. or like in the night, right? It's less brutal than like only eating one thing is actually the worst because it's just like for me like I start hating eating, and it's I don't know, just not fun, not fun at all.
I am in the same boat you are. I absolutely hate doing these kind of fasts, but I mostly of the greater key of the things in the greater key, I would say that I absolutely hate the sheer amount of consecrations you have to do because you have to consecrate every single thing. You have to consecrate it again if you go to reuse it. And it also has to follow planetary days and timings, and it's just there's a reason people forget that those are in there. There's a reason why people forget that the greater key is more than just, oh yeah, we have the Pentacles of Solomon. Go draw those and you get the magical things, because you've got to like go through an entire. It is a long process to get the greater key to work. It is a long process. Oh boy.
Well,
I
at
hate
least you
it so much.
get some cool stuff out of it. You get some cool little pentacles.
I did it with not if you make them out of paper.
Don't if you're oh no if you're going through all this shit, you are not making it out of paper. No, it's got.
No, because the alternative is making them out of metal.
I think at least like the metal's gonna hold. Like, what's gonna do with your paper? It's gonna like you're gonna put it in your pocket and it's gonna be like done.
Some of them you explicitly are told to make them out of paper, though.
I don't like that at all. I kind of hate that.
There was a pope that had the second pentacle of Jupiter, I believe, in his pocket when he died. So
I hate that so much.
I
So
hate it.
there
Hate
is
it
the
too.
final thing we have to bring up when we talk about this stuff, and that is the question: did Solomon write these things?
That is a very good question. And the answer to that question seems to be no. And I'm going to say that it's probably because if we read about what King Solomon was actually doing, it bears no resemblance to these practices. Now, there is a book that we didn't talk about called The Testament of Solomon, which is much more akin to what Solomon might have been doing. But for the most part, I would say that the Lesser and Greater Key of Solomon were not written by Solomon the King. Because hopefully he's a better writer.
Okay, so then who wrote it? Do we know? Do you know?
We don't. A guy going under the pseudonym of King Solomon, unfortunately.
Well, I guess that's a mystery we will never know the true answer to. There's a lot of these older occult texts where that's kind of the case. It's like how the fourth book of occult philosophy was pretty obviously not written by whoever wrote the first three.
Oh, yeah.
So, now, I want to ask just a few more things. So, what like misconceptions do you think people have about these texts? Because I think there's a lot. What are some that stick out to you?
The demons of the Goetia are not your friends. Some of them are friendly. Do not mistake being friendly for friendship, I would say, is a big one. The Theurgia Goetia, there really isn't any misconceptions about that, except for maybe like stuff that I'm just not privy to. The Ars Paulina, I think people really underestimate the section about the firearms. Unfortunately, because I did actually have like an experience with that, where it's like I read that and then like the next week it's like I had some scares there in my life. But other than that, like you can just go through the standard like angelic hierarchy for that. The Ars Almadel, people mistake it to be functional. It's not. The Ars Notoria, you need the Notorium. And there's a lot of the major misconceptions is that you can just go into these and just like be an edgy teenager about it and be like, I'm gonna summon some demons. When you're reading the books and you're going through the books, you find that you are really being pushed in a direction towards you were supposed to be holy, pious, and effectively you're supposed to be using the demons to make your life better so you can make yourself spiritually better. That makes sense?
That makes sense. I think the only time it's okay to be an edgy teenager and use the Ars Goetia is when you are a literal teenager. I did edgy grimoire magic as a literal teenager, and I think you can get away with it when you're like an actual like kid. As an adult though, we're adults. You should, you know, take it seriously and not fuck around too hard. What advice would you have for people who want to check this stuff out and start working with any of it, any of the funds, except the Almadel? Don't work with the Almadel.
Well, find whatever. If you have like a standalone copy of the Almadel, my advice is burn it. That being said, for the other books, if you want to work out of these, I'm going to give a little bit of a chaos magic-y suggestion here. If you want to work out of these, you should be meditating and going to other spirits. Like, if you're familiar with the Golden Dawn stuff, you can just do the LBRP and ask the archangels for better methods for the second half of the Ars Paulina. They're all the ones who you call up anyways in the Ars Paulina. They're right there. If you're a fire sign, like if your ascendant is a fire sign, you can call up Michael. He's right there. I recommend just before you go through these, I would either meditate or do your research. I'm very much for spiritual practices, if you're confused about something, go to a spirit. It's right in the title there. That's just a me thing, though. I know other people will say, like, go read grimoire compendium books. Like, grimoire companion books will help you out a lot, but at the same time, I have yet to see any grimoire companion books tell me how to replace the metal casted pentacles out of the Ars Pauline that are like 50% gold, 50% silver, carved on like a day in Pisces, when the sun is in Pisces for some reason. For Leo, I don't get it.
Now, the most important question, and this is for the TikTok girlies, is Asmodeus your boyfriend? Because there is a trend of girls on TikTok saying they're God's spouse, and he's not a god, and God spousing is really not what people think it is, to Asmodeus. Can he be your bae?
Okay, now this gets to go public, right? So, here's my take on this, and this is 100% my take. There is a practice known as binding the demons. If you go work out of the Goetia, you can bind the demon Asmodeus to do whatever you want. If you are a TikTok girly who thinks the demon Asmodeus is your boyfriend, I would highly advise not doing that, because someone can make your boyfriend their servant, and if that is the case, by proxy, you are now their servant. It's secondhand binding. It's terrible. But this is how the old grimoires work. If you're gonna... This is like the grimoire equivalent of play stupid games, win stupid prizes.
Now, I think that's all that I want to discuss on this episode. I think that's a good stopping point. Where can people find you? Where do you exist on the internet?
I exist on the internet basically everywhere. I am on YouTube at Amateur Magus. I am on Instagram at Amateur Magus. I am on Patreon at Amateur Magus. And I am on the platform formerly known as Twitter at twitter.amateurmagus. Or twitter.com/amateurmagus. I mean, Amateur Magus everywhere. Spelled,
Check him out. His stuff is really, really good. If you want to support the show, we are supported by Patreon. If you join the Patreon, you get every episode early, and you get our bonus pre-show, which is a little mini episode that I do before my guest joins. You also get a cross-quarter seasonal episode. I do 8 a year. And if you're a high enough patron, you get your name read out. So thank you to Charlotte Dickon Lee Smalter. And if you want to support me or find me, I'm Georgina Rose or Dot Darling, DAAT Darling, and I'm on every social media platform under the sun. This has been the Postmodern Iconoclast, and I will see you all next week. All right, bye.